This is Grace Rempp interviewing Randall Kottwitz on Wednesday, November 8th, 2017, at his home in Blue Hill, Nebraska. So, when and where were you born?
I was born actually in Hastings at Mary Lanning, September 2nd, 1955. Um, my mother's birthday is September 1st, so the day after.
Oh,
And
wow.
I even still have one of the original doors from the hospital at the time that a friend of mine refinished and only had room for one of them. So I've still got a piece of my hospital door.
That's incredible. Tell me about your parents.
My parents, well, let's start out by saying they were both geniuses. My father, especially in science and math. My mother was a home economics teacher for many, many years. They're both native to Blue Hill as well.
Mm-hmm.
Both sides of my family go back over 100 years here. And the tree outside the window where we're sitting is the tallest tree in town and was planted by my grandparents in 1936.
That is wild.
Yeah, the roots run deep. The roots run very, very deep. Um, and my mother always wanted to be an artist, but her father didn't see that as being practical at all.
Uh-huh.
So he insisted that she go into home economics. And she was in the very first class that lived in Love Hall at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, which is a home economics dorm where they live in sort of semi family settings and
Uh-huh.
all of that. So we went back to reunions year after year. But the pertinent part is, and I only found this out after my father died, and he died 10 years after she did. I found a paper that she wrote while she was at Hastings College that was entitled How to Rear a Gifted Child. And I'm sort of glad I didn't discover it until they were both gone.
Uh-huh.
I'm deeply grateful, but they had a plan as exactly how they were going to rear me to be intelligent and artistic and
Uh-huh.
all of those things. And they followed it to a T. And one of the major things that then influences my theater and music background is that, for example, if there was a symphony concert in the middle of the week in Lincoln, we would bolt out of here as fast as the teachers were allowed out of school, and they would take me to those productions in the middle of the week. And so, as a youth, I saw the bus and truck companies of Applause and 1776 and Company at Pershing Auditorium
Uh-huh.
in Lincoln. And I'll tell you, to this day, I have such strong visual and emotional responses to those shows. For example, in Applause, there's an anti hero in the not Margot, but the character that tries to take over Margot's position in the theater.
Uh-huh.
And I remember when she came out for the applause at the end, the applause kind of dipped a bit. And even then I went, oh, the applause dipped a bit because she's so good at being the villain. So those things
Oh.
gave me a great deal of perspective early on. And then as well, Hastings College, they were both alums. Eventually, my mother graduated
Mm-hmm.
from Hastings College, and my father went back late and graduated in 66, I believe. Whatever the year Perkins Library opened, because he walked through one of the big plate glass windows the night before the dedication. So all the photos of the graduation ceremony and the library dedication have a plywood over one of the big windows.
And that was your
That
father?
was my father.
That is so great.
Oh, yeah. But the biggest thing there was that, again, in exposing me to the arts as much as possible, every performance at Fur Hall, I also studied piano there, and every performance at the chapel I saw. And in fact, to a point that I remember my parents' friends sometimes questioning as to why they had brought this young kid to some of these controversial plays. There was Viet Rock in the 60s, and just an amazing anti war protest. But the thing beyond the message of the play, the thing that sticks out to me is there was a point where I've forgotten it was not a protest, but some I don't even know what to call it. But they wanted to give the feeling of it being a hippie apartment or whatever, and they had incense that they blew out through the ventilation system in the theater.
Oh,
And I became
interesting.
immediately aware of the role that scent can play in the theater. Um, And then there were several restoration comedies. The Miser, the now I can't remember the other one. That's the guy with all the stuff in the chairs, the drawers,
Mm-hmm.
but another Moliere, um, and pretty adult stuff in that.
Mm-hmm.
Cuckolding and all of that. When I was 7, 8, 9 years old.
Yeah, how old were you when you saw Viet Rock?
Um, well, 66, 67, I think, was when
Uh-huh.
it played. And I was born in 55, so I would have been 11 or 12.
Oh my goodness.
Um, but, given the way that they brought me up, and I was always included like just a little adult in
Mm-hmm.
conversations and that kind of thing, for me, and I guess for them, they saw no problem in my being exposed to adult material. As long, and they would set it in context. We would talk about it after, and that kind of thing. And then the night of one acts that they did every year, I've forgotten what they're called now, but
Yeah, capstones.
the
Mm-hmm.
capstones saw just some of the seminal works in one acts, the Monkey's Paw, the
Mm-hmm.
Lottery, a lot of that literature that even today is often performed in contest. Um, so I had this very wide basis in theater, even in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as what went on here in Blue Hill, there was the junior and senior class play every year, and it was always some piece of pablum that but at least it was something.
Right.
And I was in Our Miss Brooks and a number of other kind of very light
Uh-huh.
plays, but it gave me some experience on stage, and enough to make me realize that perhaps acting itself was not what I was supposed to be doing, but I loved theater.
Mm-hmm.
And then my dad got his master's degree at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, over 4 summers through a National Science Foundation program. And in that, we went to lots of theater there, theater and music both. But perhaps the most pertinent thing was on the way back one year, we went to the Canadian Shakespeare Festival, and I saw King Lear from the Eighth Row Center. And again, to explain to you how they were rearing me,
Uh-huh.
they sat in the back. We got our tickets so late that they had to get 2 tickets in one place, and I got the seat down front. Now, the eye gouging scene was a bit shocking,
I imagine.
but to see, and I guess that was maybe my first Shakespeare. That surprises me because I would have thought I would have seen some Shakespeare at the college, but I don't think I did. But
They don't do Shakespeare a whole lot
they
at
really
least.
don't. Well,
Uh-huh.
it is challenging
Mm-hmm.
literature. There's no doubt about it. But to see that full blown professional production of Shakespeare, where the iambic pentameter was not sing song,
Uh-huh.
it was the way Shakespeare should be done, and some of the very greatest actors who ever were at that festival were in that production. And then later in college, I went back up there quite a bit and saw, Maggie Smith and Antony and Cleopatra,
Whew.
and they had a landmark production of Importance of Being Earnest, which was one of the first times that a male had played the ant role. Just some amazing, amazing productions, and probably in the end inspired me later because I did work in a few Shakespeare festivals
Mm-hmm.
later on, and so kind of inspired me for that. And then there was a in the round professional theater in Colony, New York, which was about 10 miles from where we lived out there, and saw Theo Bikel in Fiddler on the Roof, and Ginger Rogers in Coco, the musical about Coco Chanel, with the original Broadway costumes, which were just
Oh.
stunning. The Student Prince, Hello Sucker with, now I can't think of her name, Martha something, loudmouth comedian.
Mm-hmm.
It never made it to Broadway, but it was on its way to Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
And in the round. So that was another, being exposed to that different sort of production. And during those same years, the Saratoga Performing Arts Center is about 40 miles from Troy, New York, where we were living, and got to see Henry Mancini conducting the Philadelphia Symphony. Probably the biggest thing was I saw in the summer a production of The Nutcracker with the Philadelphia Orchestra in the pit and the New York City Ballet on stage with their sets that they had brought up from New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and Edward Villella as the Nutcracker, just one of the the pre oh no, I can't think of his name, the Russian who was so famous, but the premier male dancer in ballet at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to see such high quality productions and such amazing evenings of music with just the ultimate
Mm-hmm.
of quality. So early on, I just had this recognition of the difference between quality and a play in high school.
Right.
And I have to say, most of the Hastings College productions I saw held up pretty well
Uh-huh.
against that measure. That theater department has always done some pretty incredible stuff, and some pretty bad stuff, I have to say too.
Oh yeah.
There have been a couple of times I've seen productions there of plays I wanted to direct and went, well, I can't do that in town because they've ruined the script.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it happens.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't try, then you don't achieve.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's a Eugene O'Neill quote I'll get out in a minute about those who don't strive beyond success and don't reach for greater failure are the world's middle classes, the
Uh-huh.
emotional middle classes. Because you have to reach for something very special if you're going to achieve something very special. And if you reach for something that's only moderate, well, that's all you can achieve. I had an oral interpretation professor in college who, with her family, ran a summer stock theater. And although it was oral interp, we talked theater a lot. And one of the things she taught me that to this day I remember was that when they were conceiving a production for their little in a barn summer stock
Mm-hmm.
theater out in Michigan boonies, they would always conceive it as though budget was not a problem, that they could do it with unlimited money and unlimited resources. And then they would pull it back to what they could actually do.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the process of blowing it out to the walls, they would discover that some of those things didn't cost as much money or could be done some other way. So they would find things that if they had only looked at the production in terms of the resources they knew they had, they never would have been able to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always used that in my conception of a lot of productions. Sometimes I'm good at it, sometimes I'm not. But I really think that I've found some special things along the way because of taking that approach.
Uh-huh.
Um, so then, in the summer of 1972, which was the year between my junior and senior years of high school, I was lucky enough to be admitted to another National Science Foundation program in behavioral science at Western Michigan University.
Wow.
It was They selected 56 people from the English speaking world to go to this special program, and at the time, the behavioral science program at Western Michigan was considered the top in the country. And we were in 8 weeks force fed 3 years worth of behavioral psychology. Literally, we'd start at 7 in the morning and we'd end rat lab at 11 and might
Uh-huh.
have 300 pages of reading for the next day. Well, there are two things that are important about that. One is I found out there were other people like me out there because I didn't really fit in here in town. I wasn't into football. I was a bit effeminate. I
Mm-hmm.
was far more interested in the things my mother did.
Well, was that something that in your growing up years was like your raising very gendered at all, or were your parents very like comfortable with like were they serious about gender roles, or was that not a part of your
Um, it's interesting. I've always said that my parents tried to expose me to everything and in the process reared a far more liberal person than they ever intended. Like All in the Family and Maude and all those things were
Yes.
on.
Were they particularly political?
No, they did vote in every election.
Uh-huh.
They were very involved in the community. That was all very important to them. My father sat on the city council. My mother was in every woman's organization in town. And of course, there were gender separations
Uh-huh.
because then home ec, for instance, was only for girls.
Uh-huh.
And there was no sex education in high school. Home ec for the girls was all that anybody got.
Uh-huh.
Um, but there was never any restriction on what I wanted to do. I was taught to sew and cook and all of those things. I served my first gourmet dinner to 10 people when I was 10 years old
Oh.
and made my own croissant and beef bourguignon and crêpe Suzette. My parents always said I dirtied every dish in the house in the process, but so certainly they weren't restrictive on me,
Mm-hmm.
and I was pretty badly bullied because of being fat, effeminate, teacher's kid, and not into sports. You add those four things together in a rural Nebraska
Oh
town.
yeah.
Now there was some protection because of being a teacher's kid, but if they weren't present,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't happen. And I do have a memory of my father having the football coach literally jammed up against a locker in the hall and yelling at him when I don't know what he'd done. He
Mm-hmm.
did a lot of things to me, but whatever, my father defended me. Um, so, although the environment in the town and the school was certainly very gendered,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that they at
The home
all
life at all.
held me to that. Not at all. Because I
Mm-hmm.
was always into the things my mother did more than. I designed the sets for her style show for the home economics
Oh,
department every
fun.
year, usually using the leftovers from the junior senior prom that year. But at the same time, I had a very contemporary view of things. I remember one year designing a set that we got furniture boxes from the furniture store here in town and wrapped them in black plastic and white table cover.
Uh-huh.
And I had, remember the old rotating color lights, and I had them in different places, and they'd come out and strike Vogue poses and that kind of thing with a runway and fountains. I mean, we did some pretty elaborate things for a
Yeah.
little high school in Blue Hill, Nebraska. And she would pretty much just let me go,
Uh-huh.
and help. They were very enthusiastic about the things that I wanted to do in that vein. Um, so no, I think the answer is no. I don't know how they internally felt about that,
Uh-huh.
but there was never any complaint. I guess that's the best way to put it. I was given free reign. I was allowed to be who I wanted to be until I went to college,
Mm-hmm.
went back to Western because my plan was to do behavioral science.
Uh-huh.
I already had 3 years of it. And by the way, the whole behavioral science stuff affects theater very
Oh,
greatly.
yeah, I
Not
imagine.
only in terms of analyzing plays and understanding what motivations were and that kind of thing amongst the characters, but also how to motivate actors and that sort of thing. So that background was very powerful, still is very
Uh-huh.
powerful in my outlook on the world. Once you understand how reinforcement works, there's a lot of things you know how to do.
Yeah, naturally.
Um, but when I went to college, what I found out was, well, first of all, the psychology department would only credit me with 1 year of the 3 years I had taken. And so I was going to have to take the other 2 years at the regular pace. Bored. I was so bored that I was looking around for other stuff to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also a dual major in vocal performance because I'd gone to Allstate and I was always a soloist. And
Mm-hmm.
buried under this old smoker's cough is actually a pretty good voice.
Okay.
And so I did have a lot of vocal performance background. So I
Uh-huh.
became a dual major in vocal performance. Um, well, then there was a problem there because the music department, because of my barrel chest and all of that, wanted me to be an opera singer.
Uh-huh.
And I was far more interested in musical theater. So, although I stayed in the music department for 2 years, I just on my own started taking theater classes. Went over and took a makeup class, and there was just something magic between these fingers and makeup, and perhaps the makeup teacher as well. She was quite brilliant and she recognized something in me. And I went from taking an introductory makeup class to then over Christmas break, she got a job as the wardrobe supervisor for the Donnie and Marie Osmond show in Los Angeles and left the university. And they didn't have any professors that had the time or the experience to teach the makeup class. And she recommended that I be basically,
Wow.
I was their first undergraduate paid, what would have been graduate assistant.
Uh-huh.
And literally, the class I took in the fall semester, I taught in the spring semester. And even then, went on to teach advanced makeup by teaching myself from the books and everything else. And I just fell in love with theater. I just absolutely fell in love with theater. Oh yeah, and along the way, as a freshman, I had gotten into Oklahoma.
Uh huh.
So I went from this little bitty gymtorium stage here to Miller Auditorium at Western, which is a 5,000 seat auditorium with a hydraulic orchestra pit, 40 some
Uh
flies,
huh.
a stage literally the size of a football field with all the wing space and everything else. And so the culture shock was
Oh, I
incredible.
can imagine.
But that production of Oklahoma, and although he's in the only in the chorus, the director kind of recognized something in me, and so I got a lot of little featured roles along the way,
Uh huh.
and so I was actually listed as a separate person in the
Uh
program.
huh.
But that I kind of jumped a year ahead from there because I really didn't do much theater after Oklahoma. And then the other thing that happened, that very auditorium, one of the cool things that they had there was the usher corps. And by working in the usher corps, you got to see all of the visiting productions for free. National bus and truck companies of just
Mm-hmm.
musicals and plays and performers and just, oh my God, the things I got to see. Uh, Anything from the Letterman to Virgil Fox to the Prisoner of Second Avenue to Twigs, and shows you probably don't know because they've kind of run their course
Right.
now, but just incredible things and incredibly well done. So that exposure to, again, what I was seeing at Pershing Auditorium, I was then seeing almost every
Uh
day,
huh.
and very quickly advanced there and was made assistant house manager, and so actually got paid there as well. And then after that makeup course, well, then I started doing everything. Oh, and by the way, the first makeup crew assignment I had when I was just taking the
Uh huh.
class was a production of The Tempest. And the director's concept was that the marriage scene, the fairy marriage
Uh
scene,
huh.
was going to be performed essentially naked, upstage quite a ways. Now,
Uh huh.
actually, the actors were in dance belts and flesh colored bras and that
Right.
kind of thing. But the makeup designer decided that we would paint muscles on these naked people so that they had this like musculature stuff. So I was looking at men's and women's crotches and painting muscles. This little kid from Nebraska who was still a bit naive was like, "Okay, I think I like this. I'm not sure I should like this." And then trying to kind of keep things in order because my emergence as a gay person
Uh
became
huh.
important along that time as well. Because although I knew I was different
Mm-hmm.
and even was called a fag and all those things in high school, I didn't even know what that was.
Yeah.
We're
I mean,
talking
what was the exposure?
exactly, and it's the early
Uh
70s,
huh.
and it just wasn't even talked about. And so then in the theater department, I met all these gay people,
Uh huh.
and I got mononucleosis and had to take a summer off. Otherwise, I was going year round. So I came home. And I had had one little experience at college just before then. So it was like, okay, that was kind of good. And I had a whole summer because I certainly wasn't going to come out in Blue Hill, Nebraska
Well,
or to
yeah.
my
Uh
parents.
huh.
And so I had a whole summer of selling fire alarms to farmers, driving all over the roads out here. And I got to think about it. And I got to think about the gay people that I knew in the theater department there. And I knew a lot. And there were two distinct groups, those who were in the closet and those who were out.
Mm-hmm.
And as I sussed it out, I realized that who were in the closet were living a much harder life than those who were out. Even though there were downsides to being out, being able to live an honest life and have the people around you know who you were was in the end the more logical way. So I went back to school and came out of the closet. And it talk about out of the closet and into the streets.
Uh huh.
I was in the theater department. And then I was in the costume department. So I'm talking chains and handbags and big floppy hats. And I was so effeminate. It was not that I wasn't a little effeminate to begin with, but I just over the top. And in the process, without really realizing it, became something of a revolutionary
Uh huh.
because even those who were out didn't, for lack of a better term, have the intellectual stability to just take it on full force.
Right.
I did. And yeah, I suffered a lot because of it, but compared to what happened later, pretty mild. Pretty mild.
Uh huh.
And pretty well accepted. Um, and so that, that became kind of a fundamental part of my life from then on.
Right.
Because it was also revelationary to me that I had been fighting for racial equality and women's equality and that kind of thing
Were you
along the way.
involved in some of those like activist movements of the
Not directly,
mm-hmm.
but I certainly was an outspoken
advocate?
advocate. There
Yes.
was no doubt about that. And I had a lot of African American friends,
Uh huh.
especially through the music department. I was the only white guy in an all African American singing
Oh,
group that did
interesting.
gospel music. They were all from
Uh
Detroit.
huh.
A lot of people from Detroit went to Western because it was the furthest away from Detroit that you could get and still pay in state tuition.
Ah.
They wanted to get away from home, but
Uh
they couldn't
huh.
afford out of state tuition. So there were a lot of Detroiters in Kalamazoo, even though it was across the state.
Uh huh.
Um, so, in fact, I can take you to the spot on South Street in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I was walking home one night and I suddenly went, oh, all that prejudice and all those rights I've been fighting for everybody else, I'm one of them too. I'm a minority too.
Uh huh.
And it was quite a light bulb. It was like, oh, okay, so I can apply those things I've learned in those movements to the gay movement.
Uh huh.
And just to kind of wrap that up so we can get back to theater, my first act of activism
Uh huh.
was to carry a placard outside a performance by Anita Bryant at the Masonic Auditorium in Chicago. And then I wrote a letter to the editor of Kalamazoo,
Uh
the
huh.
Kalamazoo Gazette, that, oh my God, the hate letters I got and stuff afterwards, because they had to publish your address at the time and
Yeah.
all of that. Uh, but I still have it framed somewhere in a box.
Right.
It's not up on the wall. But, it just, that whole thing, step by step, made me a different person, made me a revolutionary,
Uh huh.
made me willing to fight the man because it was my right, my life. And, as much as you can support others, until it's you,
Uh huh.
it's not all that real. And so that became a fundamental part of what I was doing. And Westerns in its theater program did a lot of controversial plays and that kind of thing.
Uh
So
huh.
there was a great deal of support there too. But so back to the whole theater, music, etc. Dropped out of the psych program. Was just
Bored
bored
out
to
of your mind.
hell. Had learned what I felt I needed to learn, and I still think I had by this time.
Uh huh.
And the music department, because of their trying to force me into that operatic mode, I put up with them for about another year and just said, enough, enough. I'm
Mm-hmm.
walking away because I'm not going to be a performer anyway. By that time, I'd done enough tack that I realized that that was where I wanted to be.
Uh huh.
Now, really, I can also tell you that because of my work as the assistant house manager at the auditorium, I was also getting into the whole management side of things
Uh huh.
because I got very well acquainted with the management of that auditorium. And often I would be stationed backstage taking care of the dressing rooms or whatever. So I got a lot of exposure to what theatrical management, or at least what performance management meant. And there was no such thing as an arts management degree at the time. If you went into arts management, it was because you'd been trained in theater or music and you just had a bit of a business bent and
Uh
you'd kind
huh.
of migrate over. If there had been a performance arts management or arts management kind of degree at the time, I'm sure that's where I
It
would
would
have
have ended up.
eventually gravitated. But there just wasn't such a
Mm-hmm.
thing. Um, so I continued in tech. I remained the makeup teacher and makeup assistant for 4 more years. And I realized after about another year of carrying like a 22-hour class load and still doing theater, and that I couldn't do it
Yeah.
physically. And I also came to understand that the experience of doing theater, although you needed the educational background, was in the end far more educational than the classes.
Yeah.
And by being the makeup assistant, that meant I got to work on 10 productions a year, in the black box, on the main stage,
Uh huh.
touring productions. In 1976, we did a whole bicentennial touring vaudeville show
Oh,
with,
fun.
oh yeah, performed on the back of a
Uh
fold
huh.
down truck, and so I got to do so many things and got so many perspectives. Um, they did an all black show every year,
Uh huh.
which was problematic because the rest of the department would get resentful that it would take resources away. We didn't have very many black theater majors,
Uh huh.
and so there would be two or three people from the department involved, and then everybody else would be from somewhere else in the university, and there were some resentments about that
Uh
and
huh.
that kind of thing. But it also, as a makeup designer, it's a whole different palette.
Uh huh.
It's it's really challenging. Suddenly, everything that you've been doing in cream and brown and that kind of thing, you're doing in yellow and purple, and it's just a whole different
Uh huh.
thing. Um, and then I got to do a production of Václav, and I did the costumes for that show as well. Václav is a Polish one-act play in 77 scenes, and every character is somehow a caricature. Boss Tweed from New York
Right.
early days. Hell, there's even some Star Trek in it. I mean, it's just all over the map.
Uh huh.
And every character being such a caricature, I conceptualized it that instead of doing a traditional makeup, blended and all of that, that for most of the characters, although I used traditional colors, everything was hard edged. The highlight was a light cream stripe.
Uh
The
huh.
shadow was a shadow triangle. Stuff that now people have done all over the place, but when I first presented it to the director, he was like, "What are you doing?"
Uh huh.
And Boss Tweed and his wife, I can't remember her name, I did all in black and white. They were entirely costumes, makeup, everything. They were like stepped in out of a black and white movie.
Right.
Somewhere I still, I think, have the renderings for that. So they gave me the room to experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And although they now have a graduate program, they did not have a graduate program at the time. And I still sometimes give kids the advice that go to a quality program that doesn't have a graduate department,
Mm-hmm.
because as an undergrad,
You get so much more
you get so
experience.
much more experience. You get to do so many more productions. You're given so many other opportunities. And I mean, for some, yeah, you want to go into a program where you can go into the graduate program and all of that, and I get that. But I still think there's really real value in
I really
doing
agree.
theater.
Uh huh.
Um, it's just such an important part of developing, especially at that point in your life, developing a point of view through doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because your brains are still forming, and it really is quite formative.
Mm-hmm.
And I had very supportive faculty. Um, Even in one case, a closeted gay faculty member who, I guess, behind my back trashed me pretty badly, but then apologized to me many years later.
Oh, interesting.
And but overall,
Uh huh.
very supportive, and very supportive of my adventures. Um, and then I wanted to do other things, so I was the properties guy for a semester,
Mm-hmm.
and got to do we did Carnival.
Oh.
And the thing about Carnival is it starts with a blank stage, and the whole thing rolls on, and then the whole thing rolls off after. And there's the puppet
Uh
theaters,
huh.
and I got to do all the drapes for the puppet theaters, very elaborate things with costume jewelry that sparkled when they'd spin around,
Uh
and,
huh.
and that kind of thing. Um, and then, kind of to back up a minute, when I decided to go into theater, although my parents continued to pay my expenses, they were not very supportive. Regrettably, I have to say that when they died, even without some of the other things I'm going to tell you, they never saw a single production that I did.
Oh.
Not one. Not one. And that still kind of breaks my heart. That still kind of breaks my heart. And I still don't quite understand, especially with my mother having wanted to be an artist and
Uh-huh.
being held
It
back.
does kind of seem like a cognitive disconnect
Yeah,
there.
exactly. Now, maybe that's why they continued to be supportive, even though maybe they didn't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. But they did continue to support me until later, which I'll get to in a minute. Um, when I did a production of The Women, do you know The
I
Women?
do.
Oh my God. 32 cast members. All 1930s makeups and nails and all of that. I didn't do the costumes. I was working in the costume shop and made a lot of costumes.
Uh-huh.
Oh my God. Um, but very exaggerated hair and makeup and everything else. I had a student from my class who I refused to put on the crew for that show, even though he was very good at hair,
Mm-hmm.
because he was just disruptive, and I couldn't have that kind of thing on my crew for such a big show, and where the psychology of the makeup room is really important to the success of a show.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't have that kind of dissidence on my crew, not with that many people to do
Mm-hmm.
in that short a time and all of that. Well, everybody knew I was from Blue Hill, Nebraska. I made no two shakes about it. And he decided that he was going to out me to my parents. And so he called the Kottwitz in Blue Hill, Nebraska, and said he got my aunt, who again I can talk about because she's dead, my godmother. Anyway, and told her. And then when she told him that she wasn't my parent, he called my mother. And I'm talking in the middle of the night. And they weren't ready to deal with any of this
Uh-huh.
because I had kept it completely and totally secret. There was no way I was going to do this because I feared losing them, because
Mm-hmm.
I loved them so much. I did not want to have that happen. And so the next day, not only did my mother have to deal with coming to this revelation from the phone call, but my aunt, the little busybody, had told everybody else in town. So my mother called me and she got me in an argument
Uh-huh.
and then she confronted me. And I had always said that if they ever asked directly, I would answer honestly.
Uh-huh.
Well, I did. It was followed by 6 goddamn yous screamed into the phone from the other end and she hung up on me. And I heard from her a week later to make sure I wasn't using the family credit card that I had been using for my expenses. They cut me off entirely. And then I didn't hear from them for 18 months.
Oh my gosh.
Living through a Christmas with no family.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah. Also makes you grow up.
Yeah.
I wouldn't ask anybody else to go through it, but most of the rough times that I've gone through in my life, I certainly wouldn't choose them, but I don't regret them
Right.
because they made me a different person, made me a stronger person, gave me a different viewpoint of life. Um, and eventually, I mean, the good end of this story is that when my parents died, 10 years apart, they were both my best friends at the time. It came around.
Uh-huh.
It came around. And it came around pretty quickly. They came out to visit after that 18 months. They came out to Kalamazoo to visit. And we went to see a movie where a husband and wife, one of them was an alcoholic,
Uh-huh.
and they broke up because of it. And I had just broken up with an alcoholic boyfriend. And it shook me to the core. Though it was a comedy, but at the end of the movie, I was just streaming tears because I was thinking about my ex
Uh-huh.
and all of that. And my father, this was the moment for my father because he recognized that the feelings that I had for Zentis were the same feelings that he had for my mother.
Oh my
And he
goodness.
recognized the broken heart,
Mm-hmm.
and it brought him around. To a point that even when my mother died, he insisted that my partner be a pallbearer for my mother because he wanted to tell this town that it was okay with him.
Mm.
So when they came around,
They were there.
they made a full swing.
Right.
Well, and I also think I had a lesbian great aunt and her partner who everybody always denied was lesbian, except they shared a bedroom. It was even after I'd come out and my mother was cool with it. One day I said something about Rebecca and Helen, and she said, "Oh no, 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 never." I was like, "Mother, wake up, open your eyes." No, my dad got it, but my mother just never really could quite accept that. It was
Uh-huh.
her favorite aunt, and that was just a bit too much. But and I think they had something to do with it. I think Rebecca and Helen, at least kind of sideways,
Right.
helped with that. The other thing about going to school in Kalamazoo was that if you leave, because of the time difference between there and Chicago, if you leave Kalamazoo at 5 o'clock at night, you can get to Chicago and see a show. And you'll pay for it coming back in the middle of the night
Oh,
because
yeah.
the hour goes back. But I got to see the national touring production of Chicago with the original cast, with Cheetah Rivera and Gwen Verdon and Jerry Orbach. And those amazing sets, those incredibly amazing sets, which the revival sets are beautiful, but nothing like the original.
Right.
There were some incredible things there. And I've lost track. I mean, I saw Marcel Marceau live, and it just some amazing things that I saw in Chicago. And of course, the Chicago Art Institute. There were so many other portions of art and design and all of those things that by being so close to Chicago, I got at a very young age and really influenced me. Now, my parents had taken me to all the art museums on the East Coast in the process of those trips too.
Right.
But there's also a difference between being taken by your parents and going and spending most of an afternoon staring at Sunday in the Park at the Chicago Art Institute, which is still like my favorite painting in the world. So that proximity of Kalamazoo to Chicago was very important, and to the Canadian Shakespeare Festival up in Stratford-on-Avon in Canada, because there was always an obligatory summer trip to see 4 or 5 shows in 2 or 3 days. So I was still being exposed to that professional platform. Now, on top of that, the one bad thing I can say about Western's theater program is that it was very insular. Something Hastings College used to struggle with, and they're a little better now. They used to have no use for community theater. They had no use for the other possible platforms for theater in the community. And so, in fact, they would teach bad habits, da 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 da. And I was one of the first that went, "Fuck you. I'm going to go do more theater," because there was a small professional theater there in town. One of the 10 top community theaters in the nation there, doing some just elaborate productions of King and I and Showboat, and at the same time with its own black box. And I did, I can't remember the Kurt Vonnegut play.
Player piano? Is that
No,
it?
no. It's the one with the hunter where he smashes the thing, and Happy Birthday, Wanda June.
Yes.
Yes. Brilliant show. And done
I
with some
love
dear
Vonnegut.
friends. And just, I actually got to interview him once, but that's another story. I'll get there. So I started venturing out and doing other things. And as a result, had this theater community across all of Kalamazoo that none of the other students have. I'd throw a theater party at my apartment, and I'd have 100 people there from 5 different theaters. And of course, the costume people got to know the other departments pretty well anyway, because we were always borrowing stuff from one another. Oh, there was one pair of black riding boots in town, and we all knew they were at Kalamazoo College, and no matter what size your actor's foot was, they were going to cram them into those boots. And same way, the community theater had this incredible costume archive in the basement, and that no one else even came close to. And so we were a little more community minded than most of the departments, but it was a very rich environment. I will always be grateful for all of that. And back to the professor who was talking trash behind my back.
Yes.
About 2-3 years after I graduated, and I did stay in Kalamazoo for a while, he tapped me to, well, first be the makeup designer, I think, for a production of Royal Family, which is the Barrymores. It's the story of the Barrymores. Very elaborate set at the community theater. He was directing. Well, then, because it was going to be performing near Christmas time, one by one, almost every other tech director that he had on the show, we decided, no, they were going home for Christmas. And so I became the stage manager and the makeup artist. And then one night I arrived and they were rolling the sound control platform over beside my desk because the sound guy was gone. So, I was just like this multi-armed, and he
Uh-huh.
had a very elaborate sound plot. And luckily I didn't run lights. It's like the only thing I didn't do technically. But one night after one of the performances, I was down in the dressing rooms below the theater. And oh, and by the way, he completely screwed up. He had a partner or a boyfriend at that time in New York City
Uh-huh.
and tended to just take off for New York and not show up for a rehearsal. So I'd run the rehearsal, just time after time I'd pull his ass out of a sling to get this production done.
Uh-huh.
And there was much dissent among the cast, and so I was a little counselor, and uh, I'm very proud of what we did, but oh boy, it nearly killed me.
Uh-huh.
But well, first of all, on opening night, he gave me a fish pendant thing. And the note that attached was thanks for the makeup, thanks for the stage management, thanks for the this. Oh, hell, just thanks for everything. And then one night after a performance, I was hanging out down in the dressing rooms, and he looked up at me and he said, Randy, you've got it together. Now, mind you, I didn't know any of this stuff, and it wasn't then that he apologized, but about a year later he did
Right.
because we became closer friends after that. But that was my mentor, or one
Uh-huh.
of two particular mentors. And so just that little word, just that you've got it together.
Uh-huh.
And then actually, I received a note from the president of the board of the theater saying, Dear Randy, we know what you did. Thank you.
Oh.
So there were some cool things in there. Um, and so there were a lot of, frying pan or fire kind of experiences,
Uh-huh.
but they made me better. They made me more talented. They made me more ready to deal with some of the shit that hit me later in life.
Uh-huh.
The other kind of, before we move on from college, there was one other really kind of landmark experience. Russell Grandstaff was one of the professors there, and Russ wrote a play that's still done fairly frequently called Relics. It's about the women's suffrage movement.
Oh.
Brilliant play. Brilliant
Uh-huh.
play. If you haven't read it, try to find it. I've got a script somewhere, but God only knows where I'd find it.
Uh-huh.
But because it was the world premiere of the playwright's production, and he asked me to be his assistant director. So to sit there with the playwright and participate in rewrites as it was being rehearsed in front of us.
What a pretty cool collaborative process.
Oh, just amazing.
Uh-huh.
Just amazing. And actually, for all of that, the thing I most remember, we had one cast. It was, again, a large cast. I'm 30 something.
Uh-huh.
College, you can do that. And we had a kid who just wasn't doing it, just wasn't learning his lines, was being disruptive, da 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 da. And Russ lost his temper at the kid during rehearsal. And he had another assistant director who oversaw all the tech stuff,
Uh-huh.
but I was his, table assistant director. And afterwards, he called Ginger and the other assistant director and I down. And he said, okay, I know what you saw me do tonight. I want you to know that I did it intentionally. He said, here's the thing. Never, ever lose your temper in rehearsal unless you know why you're doing it. He said, I needed, A, he needed to go,
Uh-huh.
and B, I needed the rest of the cast to get it together. Because we did have a few others. With that big a cast, we had a few others who were a little edgy.
Uh-huh.
But it was, again, revelatory. It was like, oh, okay,
Uh-huh.
I get it. I get it. And having been in one of my productions, I don't lose my temper often in
No.
productions. And if I do, I know what I'm doing.
Uh-huh.
And I know why I'm doing it. And it's because of Russ. It's because of Russ. One last little college thing, we did a production of Peter Pan. Never, ever, ever do a show where people fly. And never do Peter Pan. Oh my God, what a nightmare. What an absolute nightmare. It was just, I've probably got an hour's worth of stories that I won't go into. The one I will tell you is that I was sitting out in the audience on opening night, and you could see the wires if you knew where they were. They were really well hidden, and we had brought in a professional flying crew. But in the first nursery scene, when Michael says Christmas and takes off, as we were waiting, his wire was supposed to be to the center of the stage. And before he took off, I watched the wire start to move to a point that it not only was at the edge of the stage over his head because he was supposed to leap off a bureau,
Uh huh.
it actually went off stage. And I was like, there's nothing I can do. He yelled Christmas and disappeared through the drapes. Oh my god. Oh my god. They lost his guide wire another night, and there's that flying ballet afterwards.
Right.
And they played the on-track music over and over again, and it didn't open. And I'm sitting out there going, what the hell? What the hell? Well, they'd lost the counterweighted wire.
Uh-huh.
And so what they finally decided to do, they had everybody else flying up in the air, and Michael's running around on the ground, jumping up and down, going, wait for me! Christmas! Christmas! Wait for me! So, Peter Pan.
Uh-huh.
But then, after my parents disowned me, which was right as I was 2 courses away from finishing my bachelor's degree when they disowned me. And I had to go earn a living
Uh-huh.
and drop out of school. I still don't have my bachelor's. Because by the time I really wanted it, I was billing out as a consultant for $180 an hour. Now I really want it. But so be it.
Yeah.
Went on to do window decorations for a company. Tried to start a theatrical makeup supply company and had a partner who had the money, then abandoned it. Ended up going to work for AT&T back in the conglomerate days at Michigan Bell. Had a career there for about a year and a half, winning every sales award they had. Did the first phone stores that were ever done in malls, back when you couldn't own your phone.
Uh-huh.
We did a trailer in a parking lot as a prelim, like banks do when they're going to open a branch in a mall. We did the first one of those for Michigan Bell. I did all the store displays. I designed all the displays for the new store when it opened. Yada, yada, yada. And then I was fired for being gay. I was actually on my way to Detroit to be head of their phone store design section there. And then the local manager fired me for being gay. She actually said, at least I'm getting the faggots out of Ma Bell.
Oh my god.
And although the Kalamazoo office had never been unionized, even though every other office in the state was unionized, a month later they had the vote and the office unionized for that very reason. Again, horrible for me, but I changed the culture.
Yeah.
I changed the culture. So you don't get awards for that, but you do change the world.
Yeah.
So as far as theater and music was concerned, didn't do much after that for quite a while. Because then I got a job with a computer magazine publisher in New Hampshire. Actually with their mail order division.
How long did you stay in Michigan?
8 years.
Okay.
I was there from 1973 to 1981.
Okay.
And then I got this job with Softside Magazine, and TSE Hardside was the mail order division. And that was at the very early days of the microcomputer, 1981. My first computer in the office was a TRS-80 Model 1 that had a 16 megabyte memory expansion that was this big off to the side of the computer. But it was a computer magazine. And in those early days, it wasn't hard to get famous.
Yeah.
It wasn't hard to get famous at all. And that's really for another interview when I want to get into the computer industry and the things that happened there. But just to briefly, that didn't work out too well after about 3 years. I ended up being the partner with the owner of the company and co-owner of the company, and then he went to his astrologer, and his astrologer told him to fire me, and he did by playing the tapes to me, and then most of the other employees of the company defected, and that's how Kottwitz and Associates, my consulting firm, was born. We had a concept for a magazine that was called Living Technology that was essentially Wired magazine about 10 years before there was a Wired magazine. We took it to, now I can't remember the name of the publishing company, Better Homes and Gardens, those people. And they were really impressed, but things didn't quite work out. They almost funded it. We came that close to getting funded. But working through this world famous magazine consultant who just loved our idea,
Uh-huh.
he introduced me to just about everybody of major importance in the publishing industry, magazine publishing industry in New York. And coming out of that, I ended up with some of the biggest names in the magazine publishing industry as mentors. I met a man named Felix Dennis who died a few years ago in the magazine you probably know is not one I'm proud of and I didn't work on, called Maxim. But he had many, many computer titles and computer shows and that kind of thing, both here and in England. And I worked for him for, oh gosh, 10 years. I mean, it was as my consulting company.
Right.
But I was the guy that actually did all the research and hired all the first staff for Mac User Magazine. I created the Eddie Award sitting over there on the piano. That's an honorary one that they gave me. I literally carried the original clay statue on the plane to the casting company in Rhode Island, and
Wild.
yeah, yeah, and the Mac User was formed as a competitor to Macworld because Macworld had gotten so full of themselves in the first year. He literally threw the magazine across the room one night, called me, and said, "Can you be in New York tomorrow?" with a British accent that I can't do. And I was. And that turned just crazy, crazy, because I handled the launch in Boston at the Macworld Expo, and Felix, and now the theater kind of comes back into it. Events, trade shows, all of that kind of thing are very theatrical.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you have a theatrical background, you understand how lighting works. You understand how relationships form between audience and, in my case, models, that were in the booth and that kind of thing. And you certainly understand how a party works. And Felix had been in the business for a long time. He's his own thing. That's their books. He's been on 60 Minutes. Again, I don't want to really get in the background there. But I remember him when I was in New York and we were about to launch. And I said, "So what are we going to do for the launch party in Boston?" He said, "Oh, mate, I don't want to spend a lot of money." He said, "I've been to every big party you can imagine, and I don't remember any of them, da 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 da." And I said, I don't know why these words came out of my mouth. I said, "Felix, put yourself in my hands, and I will give you a party you will never forget." Okay, and I had like 2 months to pull it together. Well, what we ended up doing was a cruise of Boston Harbor, a dinner cruise of Boston Harbor. Before there was the Spirit of Boston, and now there's these dinner boats in every major harbor in this country.
Right.
But there was nothing like that. I rented a whale watching boat and had 14 vendors who brought on the tables, the food, the sound system, the napkins, because he wanted a different color than the other people could provide. We even served a pork and cheese course at the end of the dinner. I mean, it was just insane. And the boat could seat 150. If that boat had sank that night, there would be no Macintosh industry today. With the exception of Steve Jobs, every other famous person in the Macintosh industry was on that boat, including Philippe Kahn, who ended up inventing the camera phone.
Oh my, wild.
Yeah, crazy, crazy. And my favorite story about that is because and we delivered champagne to the guests' rooms ahead of time with a tag and a copy of the magazine in a folder with all sorts of tourism stuff to their hotels the day before the party. Hired double-decker buses to bring them to the boat. It was just every little extra thing I could think of I added. And so everybody wanted to come to this party. Well, we'd sent out all the invitations ahead of time, and it was full with RSVPs before anybody got to Boston. And I remember the editor of the magazine coming to the booth, and he said, "I need 3 more tickets." And I said, "There's no room. There are like laws about how many people we can put on this boat." And he said, "Well, I think Felix ought to bring out some of that big money of his and do something about it." And I looked at him and I said, "No amount of money is going to make the boat bigger." So, it certainly was very theatrical over the years in terms of the trade show booths and the parties. That party stood for 4 years. And then there was a Spirit of Boston. I just rented the Spirit of Boston and had to strip off all their own advertising and bring in my own stuff. And,
Right.
kitchens on board. And it
Uh-huh.
was a whole different thing by the time it had capacity of 250. And
Uh-huh.
so it got much easier after that first year. But that first year, oh my God, talk about flying by the seat of your pants. But we pulled it off.
Uh-huh.
We pulled it off. Um, and the other nice thing about making $180 an hour, there's that old adage that you either do theater or you see theater. You
Uh-huh.
can't do both. Well, I got to see
See a
theater.
lot of theater.
A lot of landmark theater. The original cast of Chorus Line. Um, Miss Saigon 2 weeks after it opened in London. Shadowlands 2 weeks after it opened in London.
Uh-huh.
Les Mis twice in London, once in New York, and once in Boston, with the original huge sets and all of that. Um, what's the? I can't remember the play about the breaking the code. That's the name of
Uh-huh.
it. Uh, with the original cast. Just play after play after play after play. Because when he would bring me to London, and he would bring me to London for a week every year to meet with his executives, because I did all of his U.S. promotion during the rest of the year,
Uh-huh.
he would then allow me to stay in his little pied-à-terre down in the West End. I was literally a 10-minute walk from every major theater in the West End. And
The
so I
dream.
could do my meetings, come home, and go do standby. Go stand in a line. I usually eat at McDonald's. I ate more McDonald's in London than I've ever eaten anywhere else because it was something I could grab quickly and run to get to the theater. And oh my God, so many things I got to see just because I was there,
Uh-huh.
just because it was nearby. And so that really informed my perspective on theater too, especially seeing London productions and New York productions.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Into the Woods. I saw the original New York production and I saw the London production. They are so completely different from one another, you could hardly recognize them as the same show from their design and costuming and everything.
Uh-huh.
Because the London production was very much done in the context of the English pantomime. Are you familiar with English pantomime?
I'm not.
It's a Christmas show that includes fairy tale characters and Santa Claus and Jesus, and it's a very strange conglomeration. And there's one done in every little
Right.
town around
Uh-huh.
the country. And it's, I don't know that most Americans would even grasp the concept if they saw it.
Uh-huh.
But I had been to England enough and all of that I did. And it's all performed in a drawing room with black and or brown and white wallpaper and 12 chairs made out of antlers and doors, and just doesn't look at all like the
Uh-huh.
American production, and conceptually very different, very, very different. Enormous cuckoo clock on the wall. I mean, like 40 feet high and 20 feet wide, that when the giant comes through it breaks and springs are coming out everywhere
Uh-huh.
and that kind of thing. But just an entirely different rendering of the exact same show. And I got to see that with a number of other shows. My my perspective on the difference between English theater and American theater, having seen, for instance, Les Miserables there and Les Miserables here,
Uh-huh.
the American productions all seem like they've been given a good scrubbing. The English productions, they're not afraid of dirt, and
Uh-huh.
so Les Mis is a very dirty show. There's lots of dust and that kind of thing everywhere, and whereas you see the American productions, and well, yeah, it could be dirty, but you don't see any dirt.
Uh-huh.
So there's, and I've seen that with a lot of English versus New York productions, that there's a big difference. The only exception I would say was I saw a production of oh, now I can't remember it. It's a very 1930s show about a newsroom and a murder, and oh God, I can't think the name of it. It's you would know it if you just put in newsroom murder 1930s
Uh-huh.
Broadway play. Um, and it's actually the press room at a police department. And the set designer, again, whose name I forget at the moment, but a very famous set designer, just brilliant,
Mm-hmm.
stacks of papers falling over and multi layers that you could look back in, and that sort of thing. Um, and it had that kind of dirty, rancid kind of feel to it that a 1930s press room at a police department would look like.
Yeah.
Um, And that night when I got on the subway train, John Lithgow got on the other end of my. It was John Lithgow. Actually, I ended up having encounters both with John Lithgow and Richard. John Boy from the Waltons. Richard. No, I can't think of his name. Anyway, Lithgow got on the train.
Wild.
So I rode on the train. Oh, I have many stories like that. Many, many stories like that. Lithgow got on the train, and something like a week later, I'm running down past Lincoln Center because it was at the Vivian Beaumont at Lincoln Center, and I've got a briefcase flying, and he's got a briefcase flying, and they caught, and we both ended up on the ground. And I got up, and now I can't think of his name. Why can't I think of his name? Richard. John Boy from the Waltons. Very famous. And we both kind of, and I told him I'd seen his show a week before and how wonderful it was, and he was grateful, and we both went on. I also had the same kind of thing with B. Arthur. Every time I went to Los Angeles, I ran into B. Arthur. Once intentionally. Once I actually went to a taping of Maude.
Right.
And oddly enough, ended up sitting next to Neil Simon. Didn't know he was Neil Simon until she introduced him after the taping was over. So I never really got to talk to him because we all left. But she, afterwards she comes out and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very distinguished person in the audience. I'd like to introduce him." And the guy next to me gets up, and it's Neil Simon.
Wild.
Neil fucking Simon. So it, I just have, and then B. Arthur, I ran into her at a production of Follies, and then I literally ran into her at a shopping mall once. I've been to Los Angeles 3 times.
And each time
I
you
ran
ran
into
into
B.
B.
Arthur
Arthur?
in one way or another each time, and I love B. Arthur. I mean, there's the whole entire series of Maude over there on DVD. But it was just, it got to be really weird after a while. Well, and the Kurt Vonnegut thing. I had done a phone interview with him when I was in a summer program on his, that was literally just about all his works. Brief, maybe 15 minutes. And then, it would have been, 86, something like that. I was getting on the last shuttle flight back from New York to Boston. And that was in the days when you could smoke on a plane.
Right.
And I was a smoker then and still am, damn it. Trying to fix that. The last shuttle often only had like 20 or so passengers on it, which is the reason in the end they discontinued the thing. But I'm back in the smoking section, and the curtains were already drawn. And I was literally the only person in the smoking section. Curtain opens. I look up, and it's Kurt Vonnegut.
I would have died.
I just about did. And then, empty section. Probably 50 seats he could have chosen. He came and sat across the aisle from me. And I'm sitting there going, God, he looks like Kurt Vonnegut. I'm almost sure it's Kurt Vonnegut. It must be Kurt Vonnegut. It seems like it took me 30 minutes, but it probably took me all of 5. But finally I just turned to him and said, "Excuse me, but are you Kurt Vonnegut?" And he said, "Why, yes, I am." And that was at the time that I was publishing. It must have been a little earlier. It must have been 81, 82, because while I was still publishing Softside, because I had a copy of the magazine with me. And he had just been one of the subjects of the Apple's Think Different campaign. And so I knew he had some interest in computers. And so I slobbered a little over him, but then told him what I was doing. Well, honestly, he was just as interested in what I was doing with the computer magazine and the computer industry as I was with him. And it takes about an hour and a half from the time you taxi out of New York to when you taxi into the gate in Boston. We talked the entire time.
What a dream.
Oh, and completely by accident. Completely by accident. I had a similar... Do you know who Doris Kearns Goodwin is? I had the same thing happen with her on a flight the other way, going from Boston to New York. And this was back...
Get on those planes a lot.
Well,
you
yeah.
should.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Oh, and you would also see, like, Estevez, Emilio Estevez. I didn't sit next to him, but he was in the line in the lobby, and you could tell there was a shell around him. It was like, don't talk to me, don't recognize me. So I didn't. You get, New York is one of those strange places. One night I went up to a Japanese restaurant and they had the plastic food in the case outside,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm looking at the plastic food and da 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 da, and I look up in the window and who's looking back at me but Yoko Ono. It's you kind of get used to it after a while.
Uh-huh.
I
A little less Star Trek every time.
yeah, exactly. But the other thing is having worked. I'll get to the rest of the theater story. Having now worked with some of those famous people later, you really do realize that thing about they put their pants on one leg at a time really applies.
Uh-huh.
It's just a matter of not being intimidated by them. And treating them as normal human beings, which is how they want to be treated for the most part, with the exception of Judy Collins. I'll tell you about that later. So all of this went on, and I was working for Felix, but Felix had kind of moved on from the computer stuff, and he was starting to form Maxim, and we kind of moved apart from one another. He started putting me under some of his other publishers, and they were jealous of me because of my personal relationship with Felix. And it was very personal. When I was in London, he'd send Dennis, his driver with the roller, to pick me up in London and breeze me off to his estate in Stratford-on-Avon for luncheon. And so his staff sometimes had a real problem trying to have me work under them because they were jealous of my relationship with Felix. And I think they were worried I was going to spy on them or something. So that just kind of tattered off. He also got very sick at one point. He got Legionnaire's disease and nearly died. But came back from it. So then my mother died. Just as I was trying to reform what I was going to do with my life. My mother died quite suddenly. Quite suddenly. Do you edit this later?
Yes, I can.
I'm pretty sure she committed suicide, but I don't want that public.
Okay, we can retract that.
There was child abuse in my family, and she tried to fix it and couldn't, and I think she gave up over it. There were too many signs around the house. My father would never accept it, and my mother and I were very, very close. One time she sent me a tape, a cassette letter. We did that in college, and my batteries were dying in the recorder, and the slower it got, the more she sounded like me.
I'm gonna check what time it is on here so I know kind of where to go to retract what I need to.
Right.
Okay.
So when I came back here for her funeral, I had just amazing experiences. In one case, I had 3 generations of the same family come up to me, and all had been her students. And one said, "Your mother saved my marriage. My kids ate better because of your mom." All that kind of thing. And it was just story after story after story, because they really were landmarks of this community. They taught their entire careers here. And Mom, I shared my mother with the community. There was one phone outside my bedroom when I was growing up, and I can't tell you how many times in the middle of the night some pregnant girl would call her because she couldn't tell her mother she was pregnant. And my mom would see her through it and take her to her mother, and, she was the mother to the town. And I came away from that experience going, selling the latest and greatest hardware and software is not what I was meant to do. The money's good, but I was brought up to do something more important than that. And so I went back to New Hampshire and decided not to pursue any more career in that. And then I kind of got blindsided a second time, which is also part of the political side, but I'll just briefly say the Christian Coalition attacked our school district in Merrimack, New Hampshire, trying to take it over from the ground up. And first tried prayer in schools, then tried creationism in the science curriculum, and then when my partner and I got involved in the re-election of the 2 moderates on the board, they put in the most virulent anti-gay measure of any school district in the nation. And along the way, that thing I told you about Better Homes and Gardens, the publisher of Better Homes and Gardens is one of the co-founders of People for the American Way. My membership number in People for the American Way is under 100. and he had gotten me involved. People for the American Way had already gotten me involved. I hardly knew what went on in Merrimack, New Hampshire, because I lived in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was an hour away, but my life was in Boston. And so people four called me and said, "Did you know blah 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 is going on in your town?" No, I didn't. And we got involved and just immediately went from a little involved to driving the whole thing. And when they found out that we'd gotten involved as a gay couple, they attacked us. And it got really, really bad. They shot at our house. I had so many death threats that at one time I had a personal bodyguard from the police department.
Oh my God.
I hosted a vigil for the victims of gay teen suicide outside the meeting where they voted in the policy. National news coverage. I got on a first name basis with every assignment editor at every TV station in Boston. Literally the week after this broke, I called people for it and I said, "I need your press list, your national press list."
Uh-huh.
And I sat up all night faxing a press release to every major media outlet in the country. And at the next school board meeting, there were 7 satellite trucks outside the school board meeting in a town the size of Hastings.
Oh my gosh.
And suddenly we were not only national news, but international news. I was getting up in the middle of the night to do live interviews with Radio Australia. Swiss TV sent a crew over because they were so scared of fundamentalism in the United States.
Uh-huh.
And it was just one thing after another after another. And that was 3 years of my life. And then I was the first openly gay candidate for the House of Representatives in New Hampshire.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. And interestingly enough, had the best funded campaign ever for the House of Representatives. I only got 45% of the vote, but given that this town had been torn apart over the gay issue for 3 years, I consider that a victory. And honestly, members of the House in New Hampshire only earn $100 a year plus free ski passes and tolls on the highways. I'm just as glad I didn't get the job. But I made it, it was a notable thing. And the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund supported me. There was a profile of me in the Advocate magazine. And, it was a very high profile and very dangerous life for a while. But at the same time, that Christmas, there were more cookies and candy and everything else that you can imagine because there was this community coalition that formed around us. So, and that's again for the other interview to tell that part of the story because that's like 3 hours by itself. But then when that was all over, and it was I guess 4 years by the time you consider my campaign, it's like I need a job because my dad had supported us through all of that. He said, "Well, you want to get one chance in your life to fight these bastards. I did it in World War II. You'll just be spending your inheritance early, but I'll support you." And he paid our bills. He and other friends there paid our bills for 3 years so we could work full time on that campaign. And it really was full time for school board. For school board. You can put him down. So then it was time to get a job. And I was still operating on this I was meant for something greater thing. And I came to this conclusion that it was theater. That was my classroom, my church, whatever you wanted to call it. And one of the most famous regional theaters in the country at that time, the American Stage Festival, was located in Nashua, which is a neighboring community to Merrimack. And they had placed an ad for a development director. Fundraising. Well, hell, I did politics. I did, I knew how to fundraise.
Yeah.
And so I went in. They all basically hired me on the spot. And I looked at the manager director and I said, "So how do you feel about having a political activist as part of your staff?" He said, "Hell, I don't care, just as long as you can raise the money." And I did. They went from, I think they had maybe 10,000 in donations the year before, and in my first year I raised 85,000. They had 2 theaters, a small black box in downtown Nashua, and then a 500-seat theater in a metal building in Milford, New Hampshire, on the river. Very picturesque kind of thing. Well, what I came to discover was the whole management of the theater was falling apart. There was some alcoholism involved. There was just lots of different things amongst the people that were working there. Lots of interpersonal communication problems amongst the staff. I did my best to kind of glue it together. There were lots of conflicts on the board of directors. I still have PTSD for dealing with boards of directors from what I went through during that period of time. The backstabbing and the intrigue and Um, and the producing artistic director just stopped doing his job at one point. He was directing one show a year and hired people to do all the other shows. He was supposed to give a curtain speech before every production to raise money and that kind of thing. He just stopped doing it. So I started.
Uh-huh.
And I got to be good friends with every major patron of the theater. I did my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon I had directors coming to me for artistic ideas. And so I very quickly evolved from being a staff member who raised money to really kind of sub rosa managing a lot of the operation because the other people just weren't doing their jobs.
Uh-huh.
And so when the producing artistic director decided to leave, I applied for the job. Well, I had a couple of enemies on the board of directors who undermined me. And the other thing that had happened was they had a youth theater called the Young Company. And as supportive as I am of young theater and that kind of thing, you don't put the parents of those people on the board of a professional theater because they lost their focus. Now it was all about the Young Company. Well, the Young Company had its, or Peacock Players actually was the children's part. The reason the Peacock Players and the Young Company, which was the kind of teenager kind of thing, the reason they had the reputation that they had was because they were attached to the professional theater that had a wonderful worldwide reputation. And the board completely lost their focus. And so the professional theater started to falter. Eventually, the whole thing closed down. But I got to work with Valerie Harper on her show Pearl as she was developing it. I got to work with the Reduced Shakespeare Company as they were developing a new musical called The Millennium Musical. Literally consulted with them on the writing of the show. They're the ones that, do you know the company? So got to work with all of them. They're still good friends. Worked with Bonnie Franklin and Keir Dullea. Do you know those two people?
No.
Bonnie starred in a very long-running sitcom called One Day at a Time. She was the mother in that show. And Keir, you probably best know. Have you seen 2001?
Yeah.
He's the astronaut. He's Dave.
Oh.
Sorry, I can't do that for you, Dave. But
Yeah.
he's Dave. In fact, we were just watching it the other night. And Bonnie, Bonnie died a few years ago. Bonnie would run around backstage in nothing but a G-string. And the poor college interns would just lose it. And I had arranged, always when we had a big star, I would try to do something special for them. I got the governor of New Hampshire to give them an admiralty in the New Hampshire Navy. New Hampshire has all of like a 5-mile shoreline. And so it's kind of a joke, but it's an honor, the New Hampshire Navy. And so I got proclamations from the governor for each of them, and I got to present them to them on stage. And Bonnie kissed me full on the lips in front of the whole production. Keir, I just looked him up today to see if he was still alive. He is. He's 81, still living in Connecticut. I worry because even then, I don't know if it was early onset Alzheimer's or what, and I loved him. We would sit and talk for hours, and he had all the right, he was very political, had all the right political positions. Really, really nice guy, but you just never knew when he was going to zone out. And the show was a world premiere of a show. I can't even remember the name of it because it didn't go on. But it was very cinematic in that there were 4 or 5 little sets on stage and they had to walk from one set to the other and that kind of thing. And you never knew if Keir was going to remember which set he was supposed to walk to or not. The entire staff would be sitting in the audience trying to go, airplane, you're going to the airplane, go to the airplane. And there were a number of scenes in a hotel bedroom where they were supposed to be naked in bed, but because they had covers, he just had to take off his shirt. And I was backstage one night, and I hear over the intercom from the intern who was supposed to help him put his shirt back on and was holding his shirt behind a half wall. I have Keir's pants. And so we're all scrambling going, okay, how are we going to get his pants back on him before he has to be in the next scene? So, and it was just one thing after another. We did, in fact, I'm still dear friends with the woman who does it, Gail, Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill. We did like the original production. And Tintypes, do you know Tintypes?
I think I've heard of it.
It was
Yes,
actually at HCT a few years ago.
that's maybe why I know the
It,
name.
it was written for our theater about Milford.
Oh, wild.
And I mean, it was just show after show that for one reason or another, either a famous director or a famous star or a famous designer, it was just amazing when it was running well.
Uh huh.
We did a full blown production of Rebecca, complete with the 2-story set and it looking like it was burning down. And,
Uh huh.
and for summer stock, which are usually kind of stripped down because of the changeovers,
Uh huh.
we did full blown productions. We would do a changeover in 5 days, working 24 hours a day
Uh huh.
with union staff. And just amazing sets, amazing musicals, full blown orchestras. And we were sold out the whole season. We would sell out in season subscriptions. It was that well known. And that damn board killed it. And I decided I would stay on as development director and marketing director because I did take on that moniker because the marketing director was the partner of the producing artistic director, so they went together.
Uh-huh.
So I stayed on because I needed the money, I needed the job. And the guy they hired instead of me had falsified most of his resume. And they didn't even bother to check his references. And I saw the writing on the wall after about 2 months and went, I need to get out of here while the getting's good or my reputation is going to go down with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I got out. They closed 3 weeks later.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. The theater in Milford is now the Boys and Girls Club. And the theater in Nashua, which used to be an art museum before we took it over, is now, I just found out last night, the citizens have voted a bond issue to revive it as a performing arts center.
Oh, well, that's...
So I'm glad to know that, but literally the American Stage Festival was one of the longest standing professional regional theaters on the East Coast, and it was the only year-round professional theater in New Hampshire. And I watched it die. And I know why it died. And it was nothing but egos and personalities and infighting, and it was just so sad to watch such a great institution go down. I still just am in shock. Can we take a break?
Absolutely.
I want to have a cigarette. Just turning on some lights. Where are we at?
I have rehearsal at 7 o'clock. If we get somewhere that would make more sense, if you think there's enough to talk about that we should have a second session, we're absolutely do that.
Because here's what's coming up. I'll give
Okay.
you a quick outline. I moved on to the Mendocino Shakespeare Festival in California, which is insane because the artistic director had no idea what money meant and would like spend $5,000 and not tell me and all that kind of shit. And we did the world premiere of Stones in His Pockets and some amazing stuff. Got kicked out of our tent and had to move the theater overnight. I mean, some great stories. Then I came back and was hired to found the Stoneham Theater and Ensemble north of Boston, which is now known as the Greater Boston Stage Company and known as one of the top 10 performing arts organizations in Boston, including the Symphony and the Huntington Theater and all of those. They're in that class. I was fired from it because it was a single donor, and he set me up to set it up for his son, and fired me and turned the whole thing over to his son. But we did this incredible production of Twilight of the Golds and just some amazing, amazing shows, and the whole story of forming the theater. Literally, when I was hired on July 5th. We had 4 walls and a balcony. We didn't even have a roof. And the theater was one of Joe Kennedy's original movie theaters in Massachusetts. We rebuilt the whole sucker and put on a full-blown production of Christmas Carol that opened November 30th. So that whole story is
pretty incredible,
amazing,
yeah.
pretty amazing, and lots of stories to tell about building a theater and a theater company in 6 months. Then after that, coming back here and working at HCT and that kind of stuff. but each of
Yeah, I
those.
think that could be a whole another
Yeah,
2 hours at least.
that's what I'm thinking, and I want it recorded. It's important
I
stuff.
think absolutely. I think it's important for this project.
Yeah, yeah. I've just been very fortunate to be in the right place in the right time. And the music stuff after, well, I went to Leonard Bernstein's 70th birthday celebration and saw a full blown production of his Mass at Tanglewood. And there's some stories there, and stood 10 feet away from him as he broke down in tears in the quality of the production. Richie Havens. Do you know who Richie Havens is?
I do not.
He was the opening act at Woodstock.
Oh my God.
And he ended up being a dear friend over the years. I presented him 4 times, including in Hastings in the early days, and some amazing stories to tell about Richie. Jay Giles. I presented Jay Giles twice as the New Guitar Summit, as the Jay Giles Band. Um, the chief flutist, excuse me, he prefers not to be called a flautist, from the Boston Symphony, and the concerts we did with him, and the Boston String Orchestra, and there's some music side of things to tell. So yeah, I've still got a lot more to tell.
Well, do you want to schedule another time for us to meet?
Hang on a second, I'm getting some messages.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. Let me just answer her.
You're fine.
I'm planning on coming to town to pick him up, and need to meet Alexis for a minute, period. I also need to drop some food off that I've sold, period. He usually gets off between 8 and 9 p.m., but it varies by the night when he's in the kitchen, period.